Hello everyone, welcome to White Wanderer. I'm Jack and you join me today outside my local boozer. Now, us Isle of Wight folk, we do love our pubs, the nerve centre of knowledge, fuddled facts and slightly inebriated advice. Now, if you are a visitor to the Isle of Wight, keen to sample the regional brew and mingle with the locals, you will soon find upon entering that there is a topic of the day, and it is the same topic as yesterday and the day before that. When is there going to be a fixed link?
Now, a fixed link to the Isle of Wight has been a hot topic for many years, seemingly splitting the island down the middle on opinion. One thing is for sure though, with campaign groups like Solent Freedom Tunnel pushing towards a feasibility study, it is a subject which is unlikely to go away anytime soon.
But today I'm not here to look at the pros and cons of such a scheme. Instead, I am here to ask a completely different question. You see, nowadays the fixed link comes to us in this ultra-modern, visionary kind of way. But exactly how old is the idea of the fixed link? Well, as it turns out, very.
In fact, the idea of a Solent tunnel harps all the way back to our plucky Victorian ancestors and their extensive railway schemes that changed the way we travel forever. In this case, the date was 1871, and that plucky Victorian was an engineer by the name of Charles Vyncke.
Now, Vyncke had heard of a proposal to build a railway to Stone Point on the mainland just east of Leap, and upon hearing this he decided to piggyback the idea, except take it one step further, or more specifically, under. What Vyncke had in mind was a sub-Solent railway tunnel, an interesting idea given that the island had only just gotten around to the concept of railways in general. Two lines existed on the Isle of Wight so far, the first of them of course being the Yarmouth Newport railway built in 1862. But for Vyncke, the mere existence of this primitive railway line was all the inspiration he needed for his tunnel.
That's because the south portal of Vyncke's sub-Solent railway idea was to be located in the area of Upper Gurnard, when upon exiting, the railway would swing east to join the Yarmouth Newport line heading south. At least that's the gist of it. Vyncke was very serious about this project, and even began sinking test shafts down into the earth at about this point on the coastline. But despite his ambitions, Vyncke was already a rather elderly gentleman, and his age proved to be the main factor in impeding his progress. However, Vyncke's ambition may have waned, but his general plan stuck fast. 3 years after the original tunnel was theorised, a young engineer called Hamilton Filton decided to resurrect Vyncke's plan. By this time, it was the Swindon, Marlborough and Andover Railway's turn to propose a railway to Stone Point, and Hamilton, upon hearing the news, hopped on board, proposing a tunnel almost identical to Vyncke's plan.
Now, Hamilton stated that his tunnel would have to be about 2 miles long, with 1 in 55 gradients at each end. And on the whole, 2 miles may seem like a long way to bore a tunnel. But if you consider that the Severn tunnel at 4.5 miles long was built in the same era as Hamilton's proposal, it all begins to look a lot more plausible.
All was looking swell thus far. The SMAR gained parliamentary approval for their branch line to Stone Point. The first major hurdle for the Solent tunnel had been overcome. But despite the bill's ascent, the project received very little financial backing, and you can't build a railway without readies. In 1882, the railway company were forced to abandon their branch line to Stone Point, and with it went Hamilton and Vyncke's idea of a tunnel under the Solent.
However, the general theory of a Solent tunnel didn't just go away. Instead, it moved to the east. In 1886, a man by the name of George Wells proposed a tunnel from here in Ryde to a point on the mainland called Stokes Bay. Now, by this time, the Isle of Wight Eastern Section Railway, later renamed the Isle of Wight Railway, had opened their entire line from Ryde Pier Head all the way down to Vyncke. And with passenger numbers increasing, the next logical step was a fixed link.
Now, it is difficult to pinpoint exactly where George's proposed tunnel was supposed to emerge on the island, but some sources suggest that it would have actually surfaced north of the pier from the tidal sands, rising on a gradient of 1 in 60 to meet the pier itself. A rather odd proposal then, but that wasn't the only peculiar idea that our engineer had in store for his tunnel.
Now, if you glance out on the Solent today from Ryde, you'll notice these isolated forts in the distance. Now, these were actually defensive fortifications built between the 1860s and 1890s, and there are 4 in this area of the Solent alone. If our engineer had had his way though, there would be 5. George's plan was to sink a huge shaft down through the Solent to the tunnel about midway, and then build a fort around it. Now, obviously, in the days of steam locomotives, it would have got pretty smoky down there if the tunnel had been built, of course. So the shaft was meant to aid ventilation. But oddly, there is also mention of a station. What for?
It's safe to say then that George Wells's plan, though ambitious, was perhaps a little too far-fetched to be practical. And it would seem the residents of Ryde at the time thought much the same. And by the late 1880s, all mention of Wells's quirky proposal had disappeared. However, this was far from the end for the Solent Tunnel. In fact, its most promising endeavour was yet to come, as all the way over the other side of the island, a rather inspired railway company was about to open its now iconic branch line.
That branch line was the FYNR, the Freshwater, Yarmouth and Newport Railway, opening to passengers in 1889. And from the off, it was plagued with woe, having to rely heavily on mainland companies like the London South Western to actually build the line, only to find out that once it was finished, they had no money left to buy the rolling stock. And so the Isle of Wight Central had to step in to run the train services. For the FYNR though, there was a glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel, or in this case, the Solent Tunnel.
At the turn of the century, the idea of a Solent Tunnel had resurfaced once again, rekindled oddly by an article in the Daily Telegraph. This article explained in great length how a tunnel under the Solent would effectively halve the journey time between London and Vyncke, a popular seaside retreat for Londonian sunseekers. Within a surprisingly short amount of time, a bill was put before Parliament, under the name of the South Western and Isle of Wight Junction Railway. And in July 1901, the bill was granted. The Solent Tunnel, it seemed, was going ahead.
This then was great news for the Freshwater Railway. Any traffic under the Solent would essentially have to pass over their tracks in order to access the tourist hotspots towards the east, which meant a big payday for them. Everything was going swimmingly. The bill had become law, and cartographers, perhaps in anticipation, even began including the Solent Tunnel on their maps, like this one, for example, showing that the North Portal would have been somewhere on Keyhaven Marshes.
But where would the South Portal have emerged? Well, for that detail, once again, we have our pals Maycock and Silsbury to thank, and their book on the Freshwater Railway. In that publication, we can see this diagram showing exactly where the line was proposed to run. It appears to approach the coast just west of Fort Victoria, before the rising gradient brings the line to an opening north of Kings Manor Farm.
So I'm on the western shore of the Yar, and over there you can see the farmhouse. Now the railway alignment of the Solent Tunnel would have plunged directly through those trees to the north of the farm, straight into the southern portal of the tunnel. And trains for the island after leaving the tunnel would have approached the bank, where a viaduct would have split in two, one heading east and joining the line towards Newport, and the other one connecting with the FYNR towards Freshwater itself. The same year that the bill passed, trial borings took place at Keyhaven Marshes. Everything was looking good and the Solent Tunnel had the green light. So where is it then?
Well, despite getting so close, there was always a niggling issue throughout the scheme. And that issue was the ferries. See, the London South Western Railway, who owned the line from Brockenhurst to Lymington, which incidentally was the railway the Solent Tunnel line was to branch off from, also ran ferry services to and from the Isle of Wight. And because of this reason, they dragged their feet. And eventually the London South Western pulled out of the project altogether. However, this did little to deter one island railway company in particular. Can you guess which one?
Though penniless, the FYNR refused to let their plans die, much like a dog gnawing at a bare bone. They remained adamant that they would be the railway to successfully connect the island to the mainland. Certainly desperation had seeped in by this point. But things were about to get a whole lot worse for the company.
In 1913, the Freshwater Company and the Isle of Wight Central split dramatically, the result of a decades-long argument over profits. The Isle of Wight Central up to this point had been running the services on the line, but from now on the Freshwater Company would have to fend for themselves. This though didn't distract them from their main goal. And in early 1914, reports arose stating that trial borings were taking place at a location near Fort Victoria. Exactly how far they got with digging is unspecified. But one thing's for sure, their progress wasn't going to last long.
Now you would think that the Great War, if anything, would put an end to a big lumbering project like the Solent Tunnel. But the FYNR still clung on to their hopeless goal, and they would carry on clinging on to it until the bitter end in 1923. That was of course the year of railway grouping. The UK's rail network split into 4 separate companies, with the Isle of Wight naturally coming under the banner of the Southern Railway. All the island's individual railway companies were bought out rather swiftly, except one of course, the Freshwater, Yarmouth and Newport Railway, who refused to play ball. And at the centre of their argument was the Solent Tunnel.
However, blind stubbornness will only get you so far. And in September of 1923, the Freshwater Railway Company finally gave in, and the line became part of the Southern network. As for the tunnel then, well, minor plans continued, but found little enthusiasm and backing. Perhaps the last interesting endeavour being in 1932, when a sub-Solent atmospheric railway was proposed. But much like the Ride to Stokes Bay proposal in the 1880s, it was perhaps a little too up in the air.
Now since then, of course, there have been various campaigns for a fixed link to the island. But one thing is for sure, if the Victorians had had their way, the whole discussion would be a thing of the past. And us pub goers would have to find something else to talk about in the local boozer. Thanks for watching.